Okay. We are on such a short, tight schedule. In fact, you'll see that there's something interesting going on between now and the next sessions, which is nothing. Those that are presenting in those sessions immediately after this one, please, during this very short question period, if we have time at the end thing, zip up to your room to make sure that your powerless point is on and in the computer. We'll hear this ding dong a bit on and off, and it's just people signing into the system. We have a few technological glitches, as you can imagine, running a hybrid. I wanted to welcome everybody to King's College in Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is the homeland and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people and ruled by treaty rights between the British Crown and the Indigenous people locally. We take this very seriously, and that's why when we're talking about circulation of knowledge, it includes Indigenous people. We will discuss this on the Friday evening session that we're having over at the Dalhousie Art Gallery with Albert Marshall. You'll see from our program that simultaneous sessions begin right after this plenary, so please get up there. And the KTS room, if you're in that, is in the floor immediately above, and the Archibald and the other room is on the 3rd floor, so head up there immediately. I have no time to thank all of our co-sponsors and all the people responsible for this. It's in the program, and we'll thank them as we go on. But I really want to give a short shout out to the two main organizers of this event happening here. Dr. Melody Frappier, who has done everything, including drive some of you from the airport and make coffee and bring in helicopters. And Megan Kemp, who is right there on the machine, trying to make this thing work. 20 years ago. You cannot believe what a nightmare it is to try to do a hybrid conference around the world. 20 years ago, right at this very same podium, Jim Secord stood and delivered the keynote address, Knowledge in Transit, to the conference Circulating Knowledge, co-organized by the three societies: British Society for Science, History of Science Society, and the Canadian Society for History, Philosophy of Science. Jim hardly needs any introduction at all. He is the longtime star of the history of science, author of, amongst many, the controversy in Victorian geology, Victorian sensation, Pfizer Prize winner, Visions of Science recently, director of the Darwin Correspondence Project, if anybody's watching from there, hello, man. Director of the, president of the British Society of History of Science, and emeritus professor at the University of Cambridge. Knowledge in Transit turned into an enormous success, this paper that came out of the keynote address. One of the most cited papers in the history of science, and certainly one of your most cited papers. As any reader response theory would tell us, it's taken on a life of its own in its readership, quite different than the intention. Now we've gone way beyond three societies, which was Anglo-centric, and our notion of everything coming in one direction from the center to the periphery globally. And things have changed greatly in 20 years. This conference is about that and rethinking where we go now in the history, philosophy, and sociology of science. Jim Secord.
Well, thank you very much, Gordon. I have to admit, at an occasion like this, I feel a little bit uncertain about which classical paradigm to take as my model, whether I'm going to be Cassandra or the Oracle of Delphi, had effectively predicted the Peloponnesian War, and then suddenly here I am now 20 years later. It was 20 years ago that I had the honor of addressing the original Circulating Knowledge Conference. At that point, I outlined a perspective on science based upon communication. During the coffee break afterwards, in the place you just had your breakfast, Bernie Lightman very kindly invited me to submit the talk to ISIS, where it was published with remarkable speed later that year as Knowledge in Transit. That talk, as I think everybody knows, has been very widely cited, much to my surprise in many ways from the beginning. Although I think this is certainly because it was ambiguous in many parts, it was open to conflicting readings. There are many issues that I did not develop and others that I fudged or ignored. Now, sometimes people have used Knowledge in Transit as a model, but my aim in the original paper and indeed today is more modest, to provide some suggestions about how we might move forward. My belief is the best way to do this is not by attempting definitive answers, nor by establishing a single unifying analytical framework, or even a single unifying narrative, but by posing questions. In fact, a few of you will know that I gave a paper some years ago at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin, entitled 7 Questions in the History of Science. Now, it's some indication of the difficulty of doing this work that the questions I'm asking today are actually mostly quite different than the ones I was posing back then. Even so, I still believe that the best way of uniting our subject is through common questions. Disciplinary reflection is, I think, a particular virtue of the history of science. Understanding science, considered in its broadest sense, requires a sharp analytical eye, which has enlivened our links with philosophers, anthropologists, geographers, and sociologists. I don't know any historians of science who seriously think that the sources just speak for themselves. As meetings like this indicate, the situation we face is changing dramatically. Once the most Eurocentric of subjects, the history of science is now arguably at the leading edge of global history. As has often been said, the term global is seriously inadequate. It is a category appropriately used only to very particular problems, defined largely by in scientific disciplines such as cosmography, geology, and geography. Reference to the global often works simply because for so long the assumption was that Europe was the only part of the globe that mattered. Studies that look to Brazil or China, however, are no more intrinsically global than those about France or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or indeed about Britain or the United States. So the term global really serves to signal welcome broadening of the geographical and linguistic range of the history of science. I think it's really important to stress that this expansion of scope has come very suddenly. And it's worthwhile, I think, to take stock and see where things stand, which is why this meeting is so welcome. In this talk, I will sketch approaches to 7 questions that seem to me important and that have attracted many and often very highly sophisticated treatments in the literature. These are large questions, much more intractable and in many ways bigger than the 10 problems Peter Gallison posed at ISIS some years ago. But I'm convinced that tackling them, even in a short compass, could be worthwhile. All right, as it's up the next. Yeah. This is the better one. Yeah, but let's see if this works. Oh, okay, that is, so it's large. Yeah, okay. To begin with, I have a confession to make. I'm not the right person to speak at this conference, nor in fact was I 20 years ago. This is because I didn't think then, and I still don't think, that circulation is especially helpful for interpreting what has happened to the history of science, or what we need to do in the future. As I said back in 2004, everyone believes knowledge circulates. It would hardly be knowledge if it didn't. The issue is not whether we should turn to circulation as a way of conceptualizing the history of science, but rather how and why science does circulate. What makes science a shared communal activity? Circulation, in other words, is a problem, not a solution or an approach. In the original lecture, I argued that a useful way to tackle the problem of circulation was to see science as a form of communicative action. The analytical difficulties of circulation are well rehearsed, as particularly in a wonderful article by Stephanie Gangler. As Stephanie notes, circulation is comfortably vague. It refers to movement of any kind and is associated with hydraulics and economics. This is clear from this famous image of Bill Phillips' iconic water-powered model of the macroeconomic cycle from the 1950s. I don't know whether circulation still holds for economics, but it is not helpful as a model for understanding science. Things can and do circulate without human agency and without the associations of social power that communication necessarily involves. Movement can too readily become a default condition. Fatih Khan has noted, with more than a touch of irony, that, quote, the image of smooth circulation probably doesn't encourage a critical analysis of, say, power relations in science. Take the familiar case of porcelain, which circulated from China into Europe from the early medieval period onwards. But the understanding and skills about how to make it did not. Or take the case of silver in the Andean regions conquered by the Spanish in the 16th century. Silver was imbued with a host of meanings by the Inca, but which the conquistadors conceptualized only as money. Here, the division between communication and circulation as models takes on a political dimension. Circulation, like migration, invasion, and other related terms, is vital in understanding many historical processes, including science, but tends to focus too exclusively on aspects relating to exchange and commerce. That is certainly part, but not all, of the story. A second problem is that the circulation can encourage a view in which making and meaning can be too easily separated. It is too easy to say that science is made in one place and then circulates away to others. This is an archaic division with dangerous affinities to the old separation between contexts of discovery and contexts of justification. The notion of circulation also goes against widely accepted understandings of historical geography, literary studies, social psychology, sociology, and perhaps most relevant, the sociology and anthropology of communication. Decades of writings in these fields make it clear that communication, despite what some authors in the history of science tend to assume, is not a stage in communication akin to movement or diffusion. Rather, as the cultural theorist Stuart Hall put it, circulation is itself a stage in an active circuit of communication. In the production of books, circulation is what publishers do when they get works to bookstores or the Frankfurt Book Fair. It is hard to see circulation as a process that occurs when a potential author jots thoughts into a notebook in a library or a laboratory bench. Understood from this perspective, circulation is only one part of the communication circuit and the part that is least specific to understanding science. Now, it is absolutely possible to configure a notion of circulation that meets these objections. In Beyond Post-Colonialism and Post-Positivism in ISIS, Kapil Raj redefined circulation as involving both processes of encounter, power and resistance, negotiation, and reconfiguration that occur in cross-cultural interaction. In itself, Kapil's definition of circulation says it all, but this is in fact not the primary meaning of the word. And more importantly, it doesn't link up with a focused analytical discussion of the kind that have surrounded the study of communication in a wide range of disciplines. Communication, as these studies show, is certainly not just about text, nor is it about diffusion with a default mode of understanding between communicants. Communication is always includes misunderstanding and ambiguity. It can even include conflict and war. There's a more general issue about circulation relating to the question of models. Like Victorian networks, Kuhnian paradigms, circulation promises a way of combining case studies into a general account. But, and this is a broader point, historians don't really need or create models in this sense. What I think we need are tools for writing connected historical narrative to explain and interpret the past. Useful tools, such as those articulated in philosophy, literary theory, and the social sciences, enable the writing of effective historical narratives, but they're tools, not models. Although this conference is advertised under the general rubric of circulation, I'm glad to say that the program is actually organized according to the categories that are central to communication, specifically research, translation, and education. All three express key elements of why approaching science as communicative action can be useful.
Let's use next.
Therapy, space bar.
Yeah, that's what. What I've just said about circulation is part of a much larger question. How do we make specific pieces of our research speak to larger stories? This is a problem of scaling, an issue that has come to the fore, especially since Debbie Cohen's Climate in Motion and also recent work in historical geography and global history. Particularly from the 1970s through the early 2000s, the history of science scaled itself primarily to a diverse array of analytical models. Important works moved from small-scale history to large-scale sociological and philosophical debates. To choose just one example, in my own area of interest, the conclusions of Martin Rudwick's Great Devonian Controversy in 1985 quite explicitly had no substantive reference or relevance to British history in the Age of Reform. They were about the nature of scientific change. Simon Schaffer and Steve Shapen's classic Leviathan the Air Pump certainly did give historical answers, but the message most readers took away was a sociological conclusion about the way we live now. I think it is fair to say that the years around the millennium, around the time that this first conference was organized, were characterized by something of a theoretical vacuum in the history of science, as was the case in other, more heavily theorized fields in the humanities. The result was a proliferation of case studies demonstrating the local character of this or that piece of knowledge. These sometimes left an impression of what can be called epistemic provincialism, effectively another Tommy heard from in terms of the local production of knowledge. My original talk pointed to the problem, and an ISIS focus section a year later dealt with the issue as well, shaping in it condemned what we call hyper-professionalism. Now, in fact, I'm much more optimistic today about the way the problem of scaling is being handled. Rather than isolated case studies, a great many works offer perspectives drawn from wider historical debates. Instead of talking about centers of calculation and immutable mobiles or revolutions in normal science, the focus is on the movement of scientific objects in the port cities and coastal regions of the Indian Ocean, the use of science by emerging elites in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or attempts to use networks of print to change everyday conversations about religion and science. These are questions embedded in ongoing debates across the wider field of history as a whole. The effort that is taken to turn from abstract epistemological and sociological frames and activities specifically associated with modern scientific disciplines are not to be underestimated. This retooling involves engaging with the full range of topics that general historians have been debating for decades, especially for students coming from a background in biology, physics, or other science subjects. This reorientation, this retooling, is not easy to make. The problem of defining appropriate parameters, in effect of relative salience, is at the heart of the dilemmas facing historians of science. And as Peters Gallison put it in a different way, what is context and when is it relevant? It is a healthy sign that very different answers are being given to this question. For example, a clear sign of the move to history during the past 20 years has been the emergence of historical epistemology, in which categories such as objectivity, observation, experiment, and so forth are now seen as themselves grounded in history. The classic book by Rainey Daston and Peter Gallison charts the development of the key epistemic category of objectivity by examining 19th century atlases. However, they make relatively little reference to commercial trade and empire, historical categories that dominate much of the existing literature, which sees atlas as instruments of colonial control and colonial violence. It's not just here that the aims are different, but the explanatory resources are too. My feeling is that it's important that these issues are brought into the open and openly debated. Such controversies involve questions about the place of history of science in large-scale narratives. In a meeting on the big picture that I helped organize as long ago as 1993, speakers were asked whether such long-term narratives are possible or even desirable. While remaining neutral on the question, John Christie pointed out that an all-capable historian, she is the very muse, Cleo Scientific herself, could find a ready-made narrative to hand, one whose specific temporality is the time of science's worldly power. As Christie said, she has her unity of action. She can narrate her big picture, not by sequencing philosophically homogenized items, but by configuring the heterogeneity of science's contexts into a unified plot of power. Well, over 3 decades later, Cleo has yet to make her presence known. But from many perspectives, the plot of power continues to be the most plausible unifying narrative for science and history. In practical terms, the field has solved this in a very particular way, coalescing ever more closely around the plotting of power in relationship to the specific problem of the place of science in the making of the modern world. This view is not new in many ways. It's a story evident in this image from Arthur Lee's children's magazine in 1912, in which Ishii purported the last of the Yaqui, and so shown here, very much in line with early depiction of Stone Age men, walks out of the foothills in Northern California to confront the spectacle of trains, planes, airships, bridges, and skyscrapers, and my favorite, a newspaper printing press down in the corner. By this point, science had become established as a powerful singularity and a spectacle of modernity. Modernity was initially defined as involving a wholesale change involving urbanization, capitalism, nationalism, individualism, professionalization, secularization, rationality, belief in scientific progress, and an orientation toward the future. As the title of Marshall Berman's famous book put it, all that is solid melts into air. In retrospect, it is easy to see that this grouping, which is still present in that exemplary product of electronic modernity, Wikipedia, which is where I took my list from, is a projection of attitudes prevalent in the liberal West in the 20th century. Modernity is, I think, better viewed as a classic case of a family resemblance. If any bond unites this fractious family in the current literature, it is no longer ideals of universal progress, of the kind celebrated by Arthur Lee, but colonial violence. Modernity, as many authors have said, is a shorthand for colonial modernity. So rather than rejecting the concept of modernity outright, pluralizing it, or believing that we have passed beyond it into postmodernism, I think we can see modernity as embodying relationships of power, of the kind famously summed up in Marx's Capital. The discovery of gold and silver in America, he said, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in the minds of the Aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and the looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for commercial hunting of black skins, signaled the rosy dawn of capitalist production. These idyllic proceedings are the chief memento of primitive accumulation. On their heels treads the commercial war of the European nations, with the globe for theater. Tim Mitchell has elaborated this idea of modernity as a theater in which the technical accomplishments of science play a critical part in creating a commodity spectacle of progress. As pursued in the European traditions, science could be hailed as the way to conquer time, distance, and other people. This leads to the critical question about how to think about a history that is grounded in an understanding of power, especially the rapidity of change associated with Western colonialism, but that also acknowledges science as the product of resistance, exchange, and long-standing and often profound cultural diversity. The late Chris Bailey's wonderful Birth of the Modern World charted the complex origins of modernity in process of interaction rather than through the rise of the West. Bailey concluded by seeing the modern world as having emerged, as he said, through the role of organized violence in creating global and international linkages, the multi-centered nature of the origins of trends in world history, and the way in which crises and responses to those crises across the world were interconnected. Accompanying a sense of interconnected uniformity is a heightened sense of diversity, of different cultures, religions, and civilizations that then could be compared. As Deepesh Chakrabarty, Alex Stockman, and other authors have pointed out, the notion of the West and as Europe as an improbably separate continent were created as part of this process of differentiation. At the same time, the quest for disinterested purity and a universalized objectivity allowed a particular version of science to occupy the a-perspective view from nowhere. This attempt to redefine rationality as a human universal in relationship to science reached its height in the final decades of the 19th century, when Hermann von Helmholtz proclaimed that the aim of the sciences for all their diversity was, he said, to establish the rule of intellect over the world. With the advantage of hindsight, it is easy to see that things didn't work out quite the way that Helmholtz had hoped. Technologies do not impose unitary forms of social representation and accompanying modes of culture, behavior, and bodily deportment. So one of the most important questions is the degree to which the development of science as it exists across the world today is fundamentally the outcome of this violent European expansion and colonization. It is likely that once conquest was underway, many of the finer grained practices of modern science, perhaps most of them, were shaped only rarely through indigenous involvement, given the huge differentials of power involved. On this view, the modern world arose through a process of dialogue, conflict, and exchange, but it was a conversation in which the parties were dramatically uneven. The history of science has been so heavily dominated by European perspectives that it will be some time before the importance of local practices, especially after the phase of initial contact, can be fully evaluated. It is not possible, however, to construct a history based on singular cases, go-betweens, or what the historian Jan de Vries has termed UCIs, unusually cosmopolitan individuals. There are real dangers, now widely recognized, I think, of highlighting individuals in ways that erases the power dynamics at work in the making of science, or that assimilates their activities to traditional categories of heroic discovery and discipline formation. The current literature is making huge strides in tackling these problems. But I think this cannot be done only by recovering lost voices from the past few decades. To my mind, the key issue is maintaining and extending the chronological breadth of the history of science, looking beyond narratives of discovery, encounter, and colonizations to consider the centuries and millennia prior to the juggernaut of modern European scientific institutions and practices. It is clear that an understanding of the deeper cross-cultural origins of science involves going back much further in time, well before what historians have labeled the Great Divergence of the mid-18th century. Many of the most basic characteristics associated with science today, the learned person, the keeping of accurate records, the surveying of resources, and the management of time, have clearly developed through cultural interchange over thousands of years. A successful and relative history of science thus needs to take seriously the very long array and not be sidetracked only to focusing only on a chronology that itself was created to support notions of progress and European superiority. I know that work under earlier periods is under threat. The entire discipline is under threat. And yet this is vital to creating a new narrative. So here is a very old object. Although by the standards of cuneiform, it is not that old at all. It's a tablet from the 2nd century BCE with calculated tabular data for the new moons for the years 280 to 210 of the Seleucid era. It takes expertise, practical skills, and a specific social role to make such an object, and at least as much of all of these things to understand it. If historians of science have a special task, it is to uncover the sources of power of this kind of specialized expertise at different times and places, to interpret what Isaac Newton termed the investigation of difficult things. This is clear in a wide variety of cultural situations, from understanding the role of scientific researchers in the COVID pandemic to the power of astrologers in the Assyrian courts. If science is so often communicated as a form of theater, as I mentioned already, historians have a unique responsibility to go behind the spectacle, to explore the workings of esoteric knowledge, practices by groups and individuals deemed to have special authority. All the traces of the past we study are material objects, whether that be a printed book, a surveying instrument, a palm leaf manuscript, or a laboratory building. By founding our understanding on material practices, it is possible to see science as an activity often associated with small elites, but rooted in everyday life. The history of science grew out of the analysis of doctrines, so that problems of language, let alone the study of instruments and images, were often not deemed to be of special attention. Even today, I think skills of close reading of texts and objects, perhaps particularly of printed books, journals, and other documents, do not come easily to those who include as our students. Many, at least where I teach, have a background in science itself. This encourages close attention to texts. I still remember when I was in Imperial College and that my class of physics students in London had read Galileo's dialogue so that they virtually knew every word on the text. But they had studied inattention to questions of nuance, tone, and voice. The skills of literary scholars, which are often devoted to texts which are full of a whole range of fascinating meanings, but often one that have been part of the generic conventions of writing that way, I think need to be applied specifically to the very much more difficult cliff base of scientific texts and technical writings. Close reading of scientific practices is expressed in notebooks, curiosity cabinets, scientific papers, atlases, films, landscapes, and other communicative forms need, I think, in other words, to remain at the center of our discussions if history of science is to retain a distinct identity and achieve its potential in public debate. Now, many of these historiographical techniques were originally seen as undermining the authority of science. During the science wars, they became associated with a lot of the attempts to undermine science. Now, science, of course, is in a rather different position today. It's in many ways under attack. And I think, as many people have stressed, these techniques now have the potential for showing science as the product of hard-won argument, and agreement, the work of many people over long periods. Starting with close reading is vital because it can provide the first step in seeing how science emerged as the most potent form of science, the social representation in the modern world. But what special practices are examining? As historians face the challenges of broadening their work to include a diversity of traditions, various forms of skilled practice, and wider notions of audiences, the prospect can evoke something akin to the response of a provincial gentleman at a dinner conversation, which was reported in George Eliot's novel Middlemarch. Mr. Brooks says, I went into science a great deal myself at one time, but I saw it would not do. It leads to everything. You can let nothing alone. If science leads to everything, where are the boundaries of its history? There are many dimensions to this question. An important one is whether a field of the history of knowledge should replace or supplant the history of science. Although I am an author of a paper on knowledge in transit, I have my doubts about this, other than in very particular traditions of inquiry and of language. And this is particularly true in Scandinavia and the German-speaking world. In English, science simply has a prestige that knowledge does not, particularly as knowledge can also invoke such widely distributed forms of understanding as how to open a door or speak a language. Moreover, in English, science is a practical activity as well as a body of understanding. It is possible to do science in a way that is not really possible to do knowledge. It's possible to get around this by speaking of knowledge practices, but that is awkward. And again, it tends to create the idea, at least for the uninitiated reader, that knowledge is in some sense produced by the practices rather than it's the practices themselves. In the institutional circumstances in which I work, basically within the teaching of a natural science tripos, understanding science as the main object is clearly here to stay. And I think the problems are very similar to those that are involved with other equally problematic categories, such as the history of music and the history of art. If you know anything about these fields, it's very much these kinds of questions are debated all the time. On the other hand, however, historians of science have for decades continuously discussed activities that in contemporary terms are now located in other areas, magic, astrology, and so forth. There's much further work to go, however, in thinking about this question, especially in realms related to practice. And here I'm thinking particularly about the history of medicine and the history of technology, which in many ways maintain a separate institutional existence, or one that overlaps in rather awkward ways with history of science. Now, I think we all know that terms such as technology and the concept of applied science are part of our inherited canon of categories from the late 19th century. The point at which Arthur Mee's picture from the children's magazine was actually created. This is a period, as Ted Porter has said, when science became technical. They too are part of the theater of modernity. Look at earlier periods in most civilizations, and things are divided up in a different way. The same is true in the present day, in an era of COVID and AI. We are witnessing a situation in which the old lines between medicine, science, and technology no longer hold. Finally, as I indicated earlier, perhaps the biggest question about definitions is not just what is science, but when. In going geographically broad, the field is often unwittingly, or by administrative fiat, gone chronologically narrow, starting the history of science 1500, 1800, 1900, or even the Second World War. Anyone looking at current conference programs and journal listings would be impressed by the range of topics and geographical diversity, but would also be struck by the focus on very recent history. I have no objection to this as a subject for individual people. In fact, I've recently published on a century I know little about, the 20th century. But I think it's important as a field as a whole, and particularly those in positions of administrative responsibility and teaching especially, to think about how to define the history of science so it keeps a chronological breadth. In terms of combating Eurocentrism, the current tendency to narrow the history of science to a few decades prior to the present is a disaster. The last of my questions is about the politics of our relations with various audiences. There can be little question that politics with a big P looms much larger than it did 2 decades ago. In 2004, I was speaking against the backdrop of the continuing reverberations of the September 11th attacks and the occupation of Iraq. Facebook had recently been founded, and Donald Trump was a New York property developer who had just started appearing in the American version of The Apprentice. I don't need to outline all the things that have happened since then. In the face of multiple crises, we're inevitably left with the question, who are our histories for? Each of us has to answer in their own way. In recent years, and especially since the pandemic, it has been clearer than ever that the way that science works, and not least its history, is subject to widespread myths and misunderstanding. Despite all the work of the past half-century, the dominant public narratives about the history of science have remained remarkably unchanged. Few historians in this room believe that science is one of the 6 killer apps of Western civilization, as but Niall Ferguson's TED Talk to that effect has chalked up millions of views. Few historians are committed to the notion of sudden scientific revolutions, particularly a one-off scientific revolution based in 17th century Europe. But that idea dominates public discussions on the internet and in popular books. Similarly, few historians believe that science is the product of individual heroic discovery. But Darwin, Newton, and Einstein loom larger over the intellectual landscape than ever before. I know this from personal experience. It helped a lot with fundraising for the Darwin Correspondence Project, but intellectually, it's a huge problem. Now, it's true, there are many things that have changed in the public realm. For example, a few women have been added to the public canon in Britain, such as Mary Ann or Ada Lovelace, but in ways I think that often distort their real activities by reinforcing the idea that the only valid way of contributing to science is by being a genius through heroic discovery in the European mold, not by being a brilliant teacher, lab technician, textbook author, or any of the other myriad roles that go into the making of science. My sense is too that the problems are likely to get worse. The other day, I Googled the simple factual question, where did Charles Darwin discover natural selection? And you will see the answer in big letters, Galapagos. With the increasing significance of generative AI, there's a real danger of this problem getting worse, that the public face of our subject will begin to approach a Marvel franchise of superheroes. Part of the problem with these public perceptions relates to the maturing of the history of science as a discipline. As I've said, the establishment of training programs at a certain point led to a comfortable sense of approved ways of proceeding, addressing issues with increasing competence, but reaching primarily like-minded specialists. This problem of specialization is far from solved, but judging from my own reading, I don't think this is the main issue. The more significant changes, in fact, involve shifts in the market, the access that we as scholars have to that market, and the expectations that the market has. It used to be clear that the way to reach multiple audiences with an extended argument was to write a book, which could then sell in hundreds or thousands of copies, and also be accessed through expert reviews in, say, the Times Literary Supplement or the New York Review of Books. That world remains significant. I certainly think that writing books remains important, but it is also, to be fair, sadly diminished from the way it was 20 years ago. The fragmentation that is often noted in relationship to political discourse is also characteristic of academic readerships. It is usually assumed the best way to get work done now for a very general audience is through podcasts, blogs, and YouTube videos. I think this is great, but in also producing them, especially from the level of production which readers understand and viewers expect, involves time, money, and skill. Competition for attention is increasingly intense, and this is important, I think, the range of useful life of many of these is much shorter than that of the traditional book. Among the most effective means of intervention is, I think, through Wikipedia, although this is easier to do for bite-sized topics. In my experience, and I tried to revise the article on scientific revolution by saying there might be some possibility of alternative interpretations without actually even saying very much what they were. And I was trolled really badly, and we had to have someone who is a Wikipedia expert help us with the problem, so that we could at least intervene a little bit. There are ways I think that things are improving, and I'm hoping that these will take root. One of them, I think, for example, is open access publishing. And I think the possibilities of that, both for journal articles and potentially, especially for books, are important. But of course, the financial issues of those are very real. Now, in posing the question of politics, I have focused on audiences. That is because it really doesn't matter what we say if no one is listening, or if those who have access to what we say are all already converted. People will have different views on how their work should be expressed and in what context. For most of us, I think the chief way we do it, and I think it's incredibly important, we have a great deal of control over this, is through our teaching. In the end, of course, what matters is not, in that sense, the number of people reached, but achieving the greatest standards of proof, particularly in highlighting the significance of groups that do not need written testimony. Many historians are exploring new and more imaginative forms of writing and expression, also including exhibitions and videos, and we saw a very interesting example of that last night at the museum. There is much more interest in working with museums, libraries, and galleries to put new work on the public stage. And finally, the question of audiences raises the issue of who has the right to speak to these audiences and to speak on behalf of whom. Some of this is, I think, straightforward. We cannot claim expertise in areas where we do not know the language or have not taken serious time to study. But beyond that, I think the field is wide open. I think in particular, in terms of our teaching, we have to be willing to move outside our specialties and to look at periods and issues that are really crucial for our students to understand. I don't think we can establish limits about who can write on which historical topics, as long as our own positioning is clear. Beyond that, the question might be a best approach from the other side. Whom are we addressing and in what context? For many years, I had the privilege of giving introductory lectures on the history of science to students in the natural sciences, first at Imperial College and then in Cambridge. In terms of what I said, it mattered much less who I was, or even to some extent what I knew, but what both they and I hoped they might learn, especially as almost none of them had studied any history or humanities at all since the end of the final 2 or 3 years of school. The question was not about my personal identity, but about taking into account where our conversations could go, how far we can take students, readers, and listeners from their starting point to somewhere else. It is, I think, a genuine challenge to upend entrenched assumptions about the core disciplines of students from other fields, while simultaneously introducing unfamiliar settings and historical frames of reference. And we need to make sure that we listen to where our students are and how we can move them from where they are. Let me end with a few thoughts. As part of a roundtable in the American Historical Review, Gurminda Bhampra pointed to the need to de-link our understandings of historical and social processes of all kinds from a trajectory that remains tragically and perhaps inevitably focused on Europe and colonial modernity. The problems that that special section focused on tended to deal with questions like clothing and food. And I think it's possible to imagine how this agenda could apply to many, perhaps all areas of history. But there is a question, I think, whether the history of science will survive, especially in contributing to public discourse, without some version of its grounding found narrative. If we don't have that narrative, what are we? Can it retain its distinctive character, or should it just dissolve into the relevant areas of history? That question isn't new, but it's one that I think we really need to think through. I focused today on what it means for a once Eurocentric discipline to move beyond Europe. This ongoing shift has also allowed us to see that the basic problems have a long history and a continued future within that messy an entity called Europe. It is not necessary to go outside London, Florence, or Paris to find people who believe that the world is under the dominion of spiritual agency or accept fundamentally different cosmologies. Most of the people that I studied in Victorian England almost certainly believed that the printing press was a God-given invention. It was not something that was invented or brought about by human agency alone. Discussion about what counts as science and when, well back before Otto Nagelbauer and Walter Pagel wrote in the 1950s in defense of rubbish. The complex and diverse history of European science, contrary to the impression one might get, is very partially understood and certainly cannot just be summed up as Europe as a single entity. Now we know this, but the question is making it work in our accounts in an effective way. In fact, the old progressive story, the art for me story, was demolished within the history of science community a long time ago. In 2004, the problem may well have been a loss of nerve as the history of science shed what seemed in retrospect its philosophical and micro-sociological water. Since then, the institutional challenges have become ever more acute, but the field, I think, is in far better shape and ready to tackle the legacy of moving beyond the safety of old limits. The solution is not to extend any and every piece of research to go beyond Europe, or in fact, to any distant region far from our primary object of study. It is attempting to show connections, debating and discussing science within what we can understand as the context of relative salience. If there's no simple answer to the question of bounds of our discipline, it is because the solutions are going to come not by changing definitions or by limiting the periods and places we study, but from the questions we ask. The science in history of science is not a topic, but as I've attempted to show here, a question. One of the most significant of the kind I believe that can bring us together, even in these challenging times. I began with a confession, and I want to end with an apology and an acknowledgement. My original talk opened by discussing the history of Halifax as an appropriate place for a meeting on circulating knowledge. I did mention that this migration and human habitation in this region had gone on for thousands of years, but I said nothing about the deep history of this place as the ancestral and unceded lands of the Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqey, and Pescotamati peoples. No one here today would make such an omission. Perhaps that is a good place for us to begin in thinking about how the history of science can move forward, both into the future and deeper into the past. Thanks.
Well, there's nothing more to say, yes. Go home. Everybody rush up to their, we have a little discussion period, we will discussing in lunch and breaks. Make sure that you don't just stick with the usual suspects, across the board, as well as people you haven't talked to before. Right now, rush up to the rooms, especially those that are presented, so that they can transfer their files. Thank you so much. This was an amazing opening. Sure. Got it.